Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nickos MTG coming at you with a little bit of a different video. This is kind of a deck guide aimed towards people newer to the format, especially ones that might be coming from Modern that might want some idea of what decks to play in the format. So starting off, how is Pioneer different from a format like Modern or Standard? Pioneer, ironically, is a lot like Modern used to be before the Modern Horizon sets. You have one or two interactive mid-range or control decks, and you have a whole bunch of relatively linear decks that are kind of two ships passing the night that try to execute their plan as consistently as possible, and the post-board games sometimes bring in some forms of interaction to slow down the opponent. So in a lot of ways, this is Modern circa before Modern Horizons 1. You have a lot of busted turn 3, turn 4 things, and then you have one or two mid-range controlling decks trying to hold it all together. Now, the centerpiece of the format currently is the Tier 1 Rakdos Midrange. Now, this is the a la Jund midrange deck of the format, or in more recent standard terms, things like Rakdos itself, or just kind of this midrange deck. This is a deck that pairs very efficient creatures with very efficient interaction. You have the powerful combo of Thoughtseize and Fatal Push, which allow you to interact with almost every deck in some form or other. And then you have early pressure in the form of Blood Tithe Harvester, Kroxa. Sometimes you'll see things like Misery's Shadow, Reckoner Bankbuster, which serves as both early pressure when paired with other creatures or card advantage in the grinding matchups. And then a plethora of 3-drops to choose from. We could cover them all, but this is more designed to be a briefer video. We've kind of covered the more in-depth versions of these decks in the past. And then obviously the coup de grace is Shoulder the Apocalypse. This kind of serves well both against aggressive decks and in controlling decks, and as well as combo. So it's really kind of this very good 4-mana play that if it stays into play, oftentimes you're going to win the game. And then, much like other traditional rock decks, you tend to have a lot of tools to bring in against things. While Rakdos Midrange is very good against a large portion of the format, much like any rock deck, it cannot beat everything, so you have to decide what you're trying to beat. Now, there's a plethora of different decks in the format, whether that be ramp and combo, like things like we'll get into, aggressive decks, or control. You kind of have to decide what you're going to beat. And just understanding that the decks that go slightly over the top of what you're doing are probably going to be a bad matchup regardless of how you sideboard and that. Where Rakdos shines is against other creature-based decks, and also against hard control decks like Blue-White Control. Often has enough disruption and pressure, and against obviously the aggressive decks, it's very good at shutting those decks down with spot removal and then taking over the game with their mid-range threats. The modern equivalent of this deck is probably Jund Saga Van or Black-Red Scam, two decks that try to do a mid-range thing with black base cards and then have a tertiary color, sometimes green, in this case black. That said, it is by far and away currently the best deck in the Pioneer format, something you should be aware of. So on to deck number 2. Deck number 2 is Nickos Ramp. Now this deck tries to leverage early ramp spells in the form of the 2-mana dorks available on turn 1, along with Wolf Willow Haven and Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, and then plays a bunch of green pips to accelerate with their Nickos Shrine to decks. Now this is a deck that has consistently been one of the most powerful in the format. Over time, it's suffered some bannings, Oath of Mist being banned, unbanned, and some other cards. This deck is probably the second best deck in the format currently, and it leverages mostly the power of Karn the Great Creator and Nickos Shrine to Nyx. Like I said, the rest of the deck is just big beefy boys, Old Grove Troll, and Polukranos Reborn, one of the newer additions to the deck. Cavalier of Thorns is both a bunch of devotion and allows you to find your Nickos, while also putting Storm the Festival in the graveyard, and then Storm the Festival is ultimately your ultimate top end of this deck. Karn is a utility toolbox that allows you to have a bunch of artifacts in your sideboard that you can wish for a lot of situations, and this deck kind of functions as a pseudo ramp deck, as well as can have prison elements with the Karn. That said, this deck does have problems against aggressive decks that can go under it. Tends to perform quite well against the other mid-range and control decks, and is actually one of the better decks against most of the combo decks in the format, specifically because of Karn's ability to wish for hate pieces, whether it be against a deck like Lotus Field Combo, Abzan, Greasefang, etc. Like I said, where this deck struggles is the aggressive decks, where it tends to shine, other mid-range and control decks, although Blue-White, if built specifically, can be a bit of a problem. The closest amalgamation to this in Modern is probably Green X Tron, while the decks are doing a little bit fundamentally different things in terms of how they execute the game plan. They are both ramp decks at their core with a Karn the Great Creator center, and both decks are a little bit slow in the earlier turns setting up, and then turn 3, turn 4 is their key turn. As far as this deck's positioning in the format, it's always been a tier 1, tier 1.5, but as aggressive decks kind of rise, this deck does drop a little bit, but with the presence of Rakdos Midrange being one of the top decks in the format, aggressive decks are a little bit underplayed as a result, meaning mono green is a very good thing and tends to have a pretty reasonable Rakdos Midrange matchup. Alright, for the third list we are looking at, and that is one of the combo staples of the format, and that is Lowest Field combo. And this deck is not unlike mono green ramp, and then it's trying to ramp in the early turns and then set up for overpowering spells to kind of win the game in an arbitrary way. Most of the time, this is done by finding a copy of Lowest Field and then copying it with Thespian Stage, then using your various untap effects like Hidden Strings, Vizier of Tumbling Sands, and Pour Over the Pages to ramp out into a bunch of mana. Then you try to use your tutors to find Emergent Ultimatum, and then Emergent Ultimatum usually finds Omniscience. From Omniscience, you usually try to win from there, usually with the copy of Approach of the Second Sun in the sideboard, using things like Mastermind's Acquisition or Fey of Wishes to fetch it out of the sideboard. The rest of the deck is designed to find your missing pieces, things like Impulse, Sylvan Scrying to find your missing combo, Voyaging Satyr as additional sources of ramp. Chandra, Opus Beacon's a newer one, but it is a card that kind of fits in what the deck's trying to do. And then a card like Behold the Beyond just allows you to stack your hand and kind of win the game. The deck is kind of built around Emergent Ultimatum to a certain degree, and so you play a bunch of very powerful spells trying to use that to win the game. Now, the deck can be a little bit complicated to play and does require a little bit of commitment to the deck as opposed to a deck like Mono Green or Rakdos, which are pretty straightforward in what they're trying to do. But that said, the deck does have a ton of options, especially with the Wish packages, and then, there are various different sideboard win cons. Sphinx of the Final Word, obviously, against Control, Zakama against creature-heavy decks, etc., usually runs some number of sweepers, because much like Mono Green, aggressive decks, especially aggressive decks with Disruption, are a bit of an issue. Where the deck really shines is against decks like Rakdos Midrange, sometimes against decks like Blue-White Control, these mid-range decks that are trying to operate on the axes of creature-based combat. This deck doesn't really care about that as long as the creature-based combat is not too fast. So this deck really feasts on mid-range decks, things like Enigmatic Fires, Rakdos Midrange, those kind of things. One of its worst matchups, honestly, is Mono Green because of the Karn package, so you'll see a lot of Besagers and on Waters to get around those artifacts. This deck really doesn't have too many considerations towards an equivalent in the modern format. Probably the closest thing would be something like Gift Storm or Twiddle Storm. This is a pure combo deck that is just trying to win the game, usually through Approach, but does have other ways. Sometimes you'll see copies of Lair of the Hydra, sometimes you'll see Peer into the Abyss. There's a lot of different ways to build this deck, although the core is about finding Lowest Field, Thespian Stage, and kind of doing the thing. So while there isn't any true modern equivalent that sees a typical amount of play, this is a hard combo deck that does win a lot of games, especially if you take the time to learn it. As it is, this is a turn 4, turn 4.5 combo deck. Now, another deck to look at is Blue-White Control. This is not dissimilar to many different decks that you might see in Modern. Mostly you'll see Blue-White X Control. You might see some of the Omnath piles with a little bit more of a controlling build. This is an MTG staple. Azorius Control. You have powerful Planeswalkers, powerful counterspells, powerful sweepers, decent early interaction in the form of March of Otherworldly Light, Faithful Absence, etc. And then you play a plethora of counterspells, Make Disappear, Dovin's Veto, Absorb. The strengths of this deck, obviously, is it can be a well-rounded deck. If it gives itself time to set up, it can often take over the game, as it has overwhelming sources of card advantage like Teferi Time Raveler. This deck can sometimes struggle with decks going underneath it a little bit, or something like Rakdos Midrange, especially in post-board games where often things like Thoughtseize into a creature, into a Liliana, into a Sheoldred, diversifying your threats, having disruption. Other decks that this can sometimes struggle against is tempo decks like Spirits that we'll talk about in a bit. But overall, this is a reasonable deck that if you draw well, can do well in most formats, and much like Rakdos Midrange, you can kind of adapt to take on whatever you want to take on. Now that said, this is not the best positioned deck in the format and can vary wildly in terms of its power and where it is in the format, but obviously the modern equivalent Blue-White X Control, a deck that doesn't see as much play these days, but is certainly something should be familiar to people who like long drawn-out games and like to think every turn what they're doing. So this is one of the better decks in the format, but not necessarily a top-tier deck at all times. Abzan Greasefang. So Abzan Greasefang is another combo deck, but this one also can have a fair element to it. So it's not entirely reliant on its particular combo like something like Lotus Field can be, whereas if it doesn't get its mana engine online, deck's in a lot of trouble. Greasefang is a mid-range combo deck. Now the combo is all around Greasefang, Okuba Boss, and getting various vehicles in the graveyard, Seeka's Chariot, Parhelion, and Sky Sovereign. The rest of the deck is largely about self-mill, so you'll see Grizzly Salvage, Vessel of Nascency, and then things like Scrapwork Mutt and Rafine's Informant to discard cards you might happen to draw, as well as Liana, kind of serving both as a mid-range threat as well as an ability to discard vehicles in your hand. Traverse the Uvenwald is sometimes seen in these builds. Sometimes you'll see Eldritch Evolution. A lot of it depends on how hard they want to go on the combo, how much more of a decent mid-range plan they want to have in the post-board games. Now, obviously, this deck's weakness tends to be spot removal can be issues, especially if that spot removal can consistently kill Greasefang. Things like running Volley out of sideboards, Ray of Enfeeblement, various kill spells out of Rakdos especially. So this deck has weaknesses to some spot removal and graveyard hate. Things like Rest in Peace, etc. can be difficult to play through. It usually has some type of hate cards in the sideboard, as well as some type of mid-range plan to flip it up. So this deck is probably most similar to something like Team of Rhinos or Living End in the modern format. Not always the best position in the post-board games, has this consistent powerful combo in Game 1, and then Game 2 and Game 3 kind of hedges between the powerful thing that it's trying to do and this kind of mid-range game plan to try to win the game. So if you're a huge fan of a combo deck that can then turn into some kind of mid-range combo hybrid in the post-board games, a la Living End, a la Team of Rhinos, maybe something like Glimpse combo, this might be the deck for you, although it does play on a different axes with it being graveyard-based. And also, certain extent, sort of like Reanimator decks, but this one plays a little bit better of a mid-range game plan than most modern Reanimator decks tend to. So the first tempo deck we get to, now there are a couple different variants of this deck. There's a mono blue variant, there's this Azorius variant, and then there's a Galactic Company variant. Not really trying to cover all those. We've covered them all separately in their own videos. But basically this is a blue creature flash deck with counterspells. It gets on the board early with Mausoleum Wanderer, Spectral Sailor, and then has all kinds of disruptor creatures like Rattle Chains to keep their creatures from dying, Shacklegeist, tap down your opponent's thing, Supreme Phantom, and Empyrean Eagle to pump up their team. And then it plays things like Lofty Denial, Geistlight Snare, keep your opponent off balance long enough to win the game, and then can take over the game with a card like Curious Obsession to continue drawing cards. The power of this deck, obviously, is its ability to be pressure plus disruption. Now, this serves them well in a lot of matchups. Decks like Blue-White Control, decks like Lotus Field Combo, decks like Mono Green, all tend to be very decent to good matchups. Where this deck struggles is decks with plethora of spot removal. So decks like Rakdos Midrange, decks like Mono Red Aggro, things that can keep up with it in efficiency or be even more efficient. Sometimes even decks like Mono White Humans can all be problems. So this is the first true tempo deck of the format. There are others like Dimir Rogues, but that deck doesn't have as long of a track record as this deck does. And like I said, there's 3 different builds. The mono blue is more about counterspells and tempo. This one's kind of in the middle where it has some counterspell elements, some just tribal synergies. Then the Bant version, which is more about the tribal synergies and has a little bit of counterspells, but more relies on the tempo elements of the creature interactions as well as spell quality to get ahead. The closest modern equivalent, there really isn't a true modern equivalent right now. In some ways, it's like Is It Murktide or the those style of decks, but obviously Murktide has different strategies and has removal. This deck is more about the tempo edge. So there isn't a true modern equivalent currently, but if you do like the play style, especially the tempo aspects of decks like Izzet Murktide or Dimir Shadow, this might be the deck for you, understanding that you are going to be a dog to one of the best decks in the format in Rakdos Midrange, but you often have a lot of tools against a lot of other things, and you can play some grindy cards in your sideboard to kind of overcome some of those weaknesses. Alright, the next test on the list is something you should be familiar, especially if you're familiar with other Eternal formats, especially Modern. That is Indomitable Creativity combo. Now this is an Izzet Spells deck that has a combo finish. Now, the finisher of choice can be different. On this version you'll see on the screen has Torrential Gearhulk. There's two different 2-card combos that kill out of nowhere. One is Xenagos, God of Rebels, and Worldspine Worm. Puts a 30-30 hasty trample big boy into play to smack your opponent. And the other one is the Scarab God and Senju of the... or something of the Falls, which basically creates this combo where it triggers, you draw a card, discard a card, draw a card, discard a card. Each time you're drawing a card with the Scarab God in play, you're creating a 1/1 hasty creature with flying that can kill your opponent out of nowhere. That one tends to see more play in the Explorer format, as obviously the Xenagos and Worldspine Worm is the preferred version in the full Pioneer format. And the final version is Atraxa, which is kind of more of a mid-range grindy version, very similar to this Torrential Gearhulk deck. It just tries to win with overwhelming card advantage. The rest of the deck, Fiery Impulse, Spikefield Hazard, Volcanic Spite, Early Red Interaction, Make Disappear. Sometimes you'll see Divide by Zero, just ways to interact with your opponent on the stack, and then some way to take over the game. This version chooses Magnum Opus, Sublime Epiphany, and then Fable and Mirrorbreaker, kind of tying it all together, much like it does in Rakdos Midrange. Sideboard, oftentimes you'll see a bunch of counter spells, Shark Typhoons. This deck kind of transitions into a more tempo-based deck where it can play, Fable the Mirrorbreaker and Shark Typhoon. If your opponent happens to remove your creativities with something like Necromentia, you have this kind of backup game plan to win a game, much like what control decks do in the post-board games, diversifying their threats and just trying to play a little bit of a different game of Magic. Obviously, the closest amalgamation to this in Modern is the creativity decks, and while they are built a little bit differently because they have access to Dwarven Mines, they don't often have to play, these weird cards that create tokens like Prismari Command or that kind of stuff, or sometimes you'll see the various create treasure cards, etc. That format is more about Dwarven Mine, Renin 6, Teferi Time Raveler. You also have the Jund version, which is about Renin 6 and Reanimation. But that's probably the closest amalgamation in the Modern format, and that is ironically one of the best decks in the Modern format. This deck is pretty well positioned. It tends to do well in the hands of pilots who are very dedicated to piloting it. So in overall events like Magic Online Challenges or Leagues, you won't see as much of this deck, but at Pro Tours or RCs, this deck tends to show up in larger numbers because it kind of checks off the boxes of being decent against Rakdos Midrange and Mono Green, and having play against a lot of the formats. So those are the kind of decks that a lot of pros like to play, so this could certainly be a deck that you would want to pick up and play. One of the final decks that we'll be taking a look at in this particular video, and that is Izzet Phoenix. Now, one of the more broken mechanics available in Pioneer that's not available in any other Eternal format is the powerful Delve spells, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time. Now, one of the trade-offs for this format not playing with fetch lands is the fact that Treasure Cruise and Dig Through Time are illegal. Now, ironically, control decks don't usually play them. They're a little bit too clunky and a little bit too unwieldy for the control decks. They're playing a lot of 3, 4, and 5 mana spells, whereas a deck with Izzet spells, even a deck like Creativity could potentially play them, but Izzet Phoenix is much more of a spells matter deck. Now, in order to facilitate that, you play things like Ledger Shredder, Thing in the Ice, and of course Arclight Phoenix, all of which care about spells in some manner or other. Other than that, you're seeing a lot of the same cards that you see in the Creativity deck, although this deck is a little bit more lower to the ground and a little bit better against early creature rushes. Pieces of the Puzzle is one of the bigger pieces of the deck. allows you to find your treasure cruises, your temple trespasses, and bins a bunch of phoenixes. And then obviously treasure cruise allows you to recoup card advantage against a lot of decks trying to grind you out, decks like Rakdos Midrange and such. So how this deck generally tries to win: Thing in the Ice against creature-based decks, flip it, return all the creatures to hand, beat them down. Alternatively, you can recur Arclight Phoenixes and beat your opponent down that way. Also, Ledger Shredder. You tend to see Ledger Shredder when this deck needs to face a little bit more of the combo decks. So when you're seeing things like Mono Green and Lotus Field combo, Ledger Shredder's, well, actually more Lotus Field combo, as Thing in the Ice is quite good against Mono Green. Ledger Shredder tends to be very good at being a faster clock, allowing you to discard Phoenixes from your hand and kind of recurring that way. This deck does have a combo finish itself: Galvanic Iteration plus Temporal Trespass. Ideally, you can take 2 or 3 turns, and then your Phoenixes and Things in the Ice can finish off the game. Where this deck tends to struggle is much like Grease Fang. It's a little bit vulnerable to graveyard hate. And this deck used to be a thing in the modern format until Faithless Looting got banned. And it was doing a lot of the same things, albeit it didn't have Treasure Cruise, Temporal Trespass. Instead, it simply relied on Faithless Looting to continue to provide it with this overwhelming card selection that would just be allowed it to see card after card after card and just win the game with relentless attacks from Izzet Phoenix. Had very efficient burn with things like Lightning Bolt, etc. Now, there is no true modern equivalent anymore, as Izzet Phoenix is kind of a defunct thing in that format since Faithless Looting got banned, and this is not necessarily one of the top tier decks in Pioneer right now, but is a deck that is a spell slinging deck if you enjoy those kind of things in Commander or Modern, and is the closest equivalent you can get to a spell slinging deck. The closest Pioneer or Modern equivalent right now is probably the Underworld Breach combo decks, whether that be with Grinding Station or without. Now, obviously, you don't have the early pressure of things like Ragavan and DRC, but very similar Spells Matter deck. You're trying to find certain key cards, and they call them the Xerox decks because you see so many copies of things. Your deck tends to do well in that regard. The final version we're going to cover in this first round of decks you should know in the Pioneer format: Rakdos Sacrifice. Now, this is a deck that used to exist in Standard, is built around the combination of Cauldron Familiar in the Oven, sacrificing that over and over again, and then getting advantage from that. Use things like Mayhem Devil to ping your opponent's creatures down. You're getting all this, you're taking a lot of game actions, basically. You tend to ping your opponent's death, beat them down. You have a decent beatdown game plan with Cauldron Familiar, Unlucky Witness, Blood Tithe Harvester, Mayhem Devil. Once again, you get to play Fable the Mirror Breaker in all these decks. But the real power in this deck is the things like Claim the Firstborn to steal your opponent's creatures, and then sacrificing them with either Witch's Oven or Deadly Dispute. This kind of allows you to really be really good against the low-to-the-ground creature decks. Now, this deck, until recently, had kind of been on the decline, but with the resurgence of one of the other aggro decks that we're not covering in this video, that being Boros Convoke, this deck made a huge comeback, as it's a very good counter to that, while having good game against a lot of the other format. One of its struggles tends to be, unfortunately, Mono Green, because Mono Green just kind of overpowers what this deck does. Now, that said, a good sack pilot can find ways around that. Use things like Karizev's Expertise to steal your opponent's big stuff. So, much like Rakdos Midrange, this is a very good deck in the format, but tends to be a lot better when creature-based decks are a thing. There really is, I guess the closest modern equivalent would be something like Yawgmoth. While those decks are a little bit different in what they execute, Yawgmoth being more of a creature combo deck, this being more of a control creature deck, or control-based creature deck. They still kind of have a lot of the same elements of things being sacrificed for value, lots of triggers to keep track of, etc. So if you like Golgari Yawgmoth, this might be the closest equivalent to you for the Pioneer format. So that said, that's about all the decks we're going to cover in this video. I believe that covers like 8 or 9 of the top decks of the format, and some of the modern equivalencies. I'll probably also be doing a write-up along with this video. Something a little bit different. Now, obviously, we've covered all of these decks on the channel in terms of bigger, longer deck guides, if you want to check that out. There is some gameplay for most of the decks. We have kind of playlists for each of those if you want to get a better idea. As far as other resources for the Pioneer format, Amiyo02 has a bunch of deck guides on his channel. Other content creators that do a lot of Pioneer work. Dark Jason, until recently, was a very large Pioneer contributor. He no longer seems to be active in terms of Twitch and YouTube. Doomwake does a lot of Pioneer content, and Tandy, Todd Anderson, does a lot of Pioneer-based combat or content. I'm sure there are others out there that do a lot of Pioneer content. There are some specific players, like Misplaced Ginger plays a lot of Rakdos Midrange, but does give you a good idea of where to springboard off into the format. But this is kind of your beginner's guide to the top decks in the format and some of their modern equivalents if you're coming from that format learning to play Pioneer.